Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Ayin Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Diana Bloom in loving memory of her Babi, Ita Rosa Sanaben Marmarek, on her yurt site. She was an active member of the Jewish community in Buenos Aires, holding many leadership roles, a successful businesswoman, a lifelong committed Zionist, and an adoring grandmother. I miss her very much. Okay, we're going to get started. We'll do a quick review because we're mamash in the middle of a sugya. So we started all the way back on Ayin Ham at the Mishna, about this big machloka between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis about can you bring an item, what we call lebeit psul, can you, when you have an intermingled group of sacrifices and you want to basically bring them all because, and the best thing is to go by the more stringent, which is important. On the other hand, there's a price to pay for that, which is you might cause sanctified items to be disqualified because it'll turn into notar. Let's say you have your asham and shlamim, so the asham turns into notar the next morning, whereas if it's shlamim, it only becomes notar at the end of that next day. So, since we have to be stringent, we say already the next morning, if you leave it over, it's going to be notar. Rabbi Shimon says that doesn't bother us. And the rabbis don't accept that because they say, what do you mean? You're not allowed to bring things to Beit Psul. Came Rava, and Rava said, Rabbi Shimon only said this, b'di'evet, not l'chatchila. Post facto, if it happens, so fine. But if you have these animals and they're alive, don't just bring them both on the altar, right? But leave them till they graze, let them get a mum, right? In other words, then there's a question how we deal with our Mishna. But Rabbi Shimon only says it if it's after the fact. Now you might say the intermingling is after the fact. That's how we deal with that issue. But basically, they say, Rava says this is only b'di'evet. Rabbi Shimon would never allow us to actively make a decision. Let's just go ahead and do this when we're going to bring things to Beit Psul. So we had a slew of questions on that. The last question being, what about the Asham Mitzorah, safek Mitzorah, someone who's not sure if they're a leper or not. And they want to bring a korban to get out of this safek status, this doubtful, maybe because obviously if you're in doubt that you're a mitzvah, you have to be out of the community, and nobody wants that. So what do we allow you to do? You bring your korban, mishum safek, maybe it's an asham mitzvah, if not, it'll be a shlamim. And that's an example of, we actively allow you to go create a situation where you're going to bring things, as we call lebeit psul, that it might be disqualified early if it's really only a shlamim. To which we answered, tikune gavra is more important, okay, which is a fascinating answer, right? Which makes a lot of sense. Sometimes we override things because, right, it's almost like saying it's a post facto situation, right? We want to fix this situation. It's a bad situation. We'll allow for it in that case. Then we said, okay, fine, that deals with the asham. What about the log shemen? We're in the middle of this long discussion about the log shemen. What do we say? Well, the oil that goes with the leper, because remember, Rabbi Shimon said, you bring the asham with its log shemen. So how do you do that? Because what's a nedava for a shemen? Well, you have to do a kamit, so you have to take out a handful, burn it on the altar. So we said, okay, so you do both. You take a handful, burn it on the altar. If you're a leper, the Kohen takes some of the oil in his hand, then he sprinkles it toward the parochet. Then he puts it on the finger, the toe, and the nose, the ear of the leper, and smears the rest of it on the head of the leper, and whatever's left goes to the kohanim. In both situations, whatever's left goes to the kohanim, whether it's he took a kometz and burnt that on the altar and that. So we have a good situation. But then they said, wait a minute, we have to burn it. So they say, so what's the problem? Burn it. Well, when are you going to burn it? What's the order of events? So then we're up to, where are we up to? Well, we're up to a problem because they say, if you do it after the Matnot Sheva, it's a problem because there's shirayim that now got lessened between the time of kmitza and burning. So you can't do a break between the kmitza and the burning and take some more oil out of there. That's a problem. So burn it before. Do the kometz, the burning. Take care of all your if it's a nedava, and then you do all the mitzorah stuff. But they say, what's the problem? Well, you can't then take the oil and sprinkle it on the parochet because that's like putting something on the altar. And these psukim that we're going to actually see both the psukim today in a different context, but these psukim in Sefer Vayikra chapter 2 verses 11 and 12 say, Kol mincha asher takrivu laHashem, any mincha offering you bring to God, lo te'aseh chametz, you can't make a chametz, ki kol se'or v'chol dvash lo taktiru mimenu isha laHashem. You can't put seor, leavening, anything leavened, or honey, can't be burned from it as something to God. Okay, the next pasuk we'll get to later. Oh, maybe we'll read the next pasuk already. Korban reshit takrivu otam. Okay, Rashi on the Torah there says, what does it mean, korban reshit? Bring the first sacrifice from them. Well, there's the shtei alechem, which is the first sacrifice brought from the wheat of that year on Shavuot, and the bikurim are brought on Shavuot from the fruits. So the seor can go in the shtei alechem. It's one of the two sacrifice mincha offerings that can be actually chametz, and it has to be chametz. And the dvash really comes from the figs and the dates, so that you can bring as bikurim. Okay, those can be brought to God. First of all, they're not burnt on the altar at all. So those you can bring. But you cannot offer the seor and dvash on the altar to burn. Okay, so the first thing we learn from this pasuk is what we ended the previous daf with. Now, this is not the simple reading of the pasuk, but because at the end of the first pasuk it says, Lo taktiru mimenu ishal Hashem, don't sacrifice from them, from the seor and dvash, it means. But the drasha is, if you sacrificed, you took from some part of something, like this kmitza you took out, and you burnt it, the remainder you can't do, right? This is like Sunday night leftovers, right? Who wants Sunday night leftovers, right? You're certainly not going to bring them to God, right? Like if you had guests on Sunday, right? Maybe your kids you'll serve leftovers to, or to yourselves, but you're not going to go bringing that to God, right? That's really not appropriate. So you can't go burning something that you already took out something to go burn from there, and then with the remainder. So there's no way to then take and sprinkle if it's the remainder. So they answered, and this gets us up to today, no, but that next pasuk says you can't bring it l'reach nichach. But what does that mean? You can bring it l'shem eitzim. So you can take from this remainder and sprinkle it on this. Now, either it's the mitzorah's sacrifice, in which case what you did before was nothing. The fact that you took a handful of oil and burnt it on the altar, that was just to help the fire get going. And now you're doing what you're supposed to do. And if it's the reverse, then what you're doing now by sprinkling, you're just sprinkling random oil on the parochet. It doesn't have significance. So that is all fine, because you can't bring it on the altar to offer something to God. But if you're taking those leftovers and you're using them just to make the fire go better, it's fine. Okay, so that seems okay. But we're going to still have further problems here. Now starting at the top of Ayin Zayin. Now we already said that what happens after you take the kmitza out, you need a whole log of oil in order to do the mitzorah process. So you're going to have to add a little more oil to it. Well, now you have a problem, because ikach porta de lo kametz ilave. There's some part now of the shirayim that you actually didn't take a kmitza of. Now what's supposed to happen? Whether you offered a voluntary offering and they took a kmitza out and the rest was permitted to the kohen, or you did the log shemen, and you did the handful, the kohen puts some in his hand, not exactly a handful, but he puts some in his hand, and he does the sprinkling for the leper, and then the kohen's left with the shirayim. Either which way, the kohen gets the leftovers. The problem is that if it's really only an adava, the first, right, I say first because that's the one you're dealing with first, and then you added some more oil to it, and now you're permitting the rest to the kohen, but you now have a mixture of remainder and the first, most of it is the remainder where you had done the kmitza, right? You did a kmitza, you took a handful out for that offering and left the remainder. But now you added more in order to do the process of the leper. So you now have some oil mixed in there that you didn't actually take a kmitza from. Now the kohen can only eat the remainder if all of that remainder was, whatever's the remainder, was really a remainder from the kmitza, from the handful they took for the voluntary offering. So assuming, let's say, it's voluntary and it's not the leper, because remember, we have to deal with both options. Both have to work independently. So now you've added more oil to it, and the kohen is not allowed to eat something that you now have added something that didn't have the kometz taken out of. Because again, you do kometz, burning, then you add some more, and then you do the leper process. So that adding is going to be a problem. So they say, fine, deparikle, they redeem it. So you take the value of however much, a handful's worth that you removed from there, and you put it onto a coin. You say the value of that extra oil, I'm redeeming onto a coin, so whatever is in there is now chulin. It's just not sanctified at all. Okay, in other words, again, if it was a metzora, so fine, it was, and you used it. But now, once you finish, you say, okay, now I'm redeeming that extra part, so that there's chulin in there, and then the kohen can eat, because it's shirayim that you took a kmitza on, plus chulin. So you redeemed it, it's fine. To which the Gemara asks further, where exactly are you doing the redeeming of this? Igavai, if inside the azara, which is where you are and where the oil is and all that, you have a problem, because you're now redeeming some of this oil and turning it to chulin. And there's a principle, kam ay chulin lazara, you're now bringing chulin into the azara, which you're not allowed to bring in chulin to the azara. Iabarai, if you do it outside, what's the problem? So take the oil outside. Well, I feel like I'm in a store, and you took the item out of the store with the thing on it that beeps, you walk out and beep, 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 you can't take this out. This is not allowed until you buy it, right? You can't remove anything from the azara that's sanctified. The oil is sanctified. And once you remove it, it's going to disqualify it, and you can't bring it back in and then, right, continue with, first of all, it's shirayim for the kohen to use, but he has to use it as a sanctified way. It's from an asham. So actually it's in either which way, right? It's in the it's for the asham, it's for all. Anyway, you're going to disqualify it. So, la'olam gavai. You do this inside. How do you deal with the chulin basara problem? Chulin mimela havyan. Wait, this isn't bringing chulin into the azara. What's bringing chulin into the azara? It's the reverse of what I just said. It's walking into the azara, bringing chulin with you. This you did, it was already in the azara. You're just redeeming it and turning it into chulin in the azara. That's not a problem. It happens in the azara. That's right. It's different. Like if you come in your tameh to the mikdash, it's a problem. If you become tameh in the mikdash, we're not going to punish you. It wasn't your fault. Maybe could have been avoidable, but it's not like I'm tameh, I'm walking into the temple. Obviously, remember you have to leave, and you have to leave in the quickest way possible, but the shortest route. But right, we're not going to penalize you for something that happened inside, so we allow this to go on because you're not bringing the chulin into the azara. It just happens in there. Okay, so it seems like we're good, but now they add one last question, which is a big whammy. V'ha'amar Rabbi Shimon ein nadvim shemen. But wait, this is all Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Remember, Rava talked about Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon doesn't allow this lechatchila. The Gemara asks, but what do you mean? Rabbi Shimon says, bring the asham with its log, all that. And what did we say? Why does it work? Because the log can be either a voluntary one or for the leper. But Rabbi Shimon holds that you can't voluntarily bring an oil gift to the temple. Now, I can't just bring any gift I want into the temple. There's unique gifts I can give. I can bring a sacrifice. I can bring a meal offering, right? I can bring a bird or an animal sacrifice. I can bring a meal offering. Like, there's certain types of nidavot I can bring. I can't just bring an oil gift if I want, according to Rabbi Shimon. There's a machloket about it. Now, why is oil, right? It's not like I'm bringing flowers to the temple, right? Or something, okay? So I'm going to offer flowers and burn them on the altar. So that, obviously, I can't do. It's not listed anywhere as something people bring. Okay? But it talks about libations. There's oil libations. There's wine libations. So there are, now in the Torah, though, they're only mentioned as, the oil is only mentioned as one that goes with a sacrifice. So Rabbi Shimon says you can't offer it just voluntarily. It's just not one of the options. So how could you possibly say that according to Rabbi Shimon, we're doing this as an either optional oil or for the leper? So that's a really big question. But the Gemara has a pretty clear answer, and that's why part of the reason why I went all the way back today, because he says tikune gavra shani. While you might not be able to bring an oil libation, it's different than bringing, right, an oil voluntary libation. It's different than bringing a regular, anything random, because there is such a principle. There is a place for it, a precedent. In these libations, we bring the go with the sacrifices. So there is some situation where we bring oil. So in a case where we have to fix this person and there's no other choice, we're going to allow this. Just like before, we said maybe he doesn't normally allow it lechatchila, but he will in this case to fix the person. So again, we go back to that same answer. To fix a person, we're going to allow it. Now we're going to go all the way back, and again, that's why I started from the beginning here, all the way back to the beginning of the Metzora, the leper, and the asham. Now we're going to ask a different question. So we've resolved the oil, even though we asked this big question at the end that Rabbi Shimon seems to completely contradict himself, but no, because Rabbi Shimon's going to be more lenient in this case in order to fix the person. and again, allow him back into society. Now comes Rav Rachuma. Yativ Rav Rachuma kamei de Ravina. So Rav Rachuma was sitting before Ravina, v'yativ v'kamra. And he sits and he says the following Mishmei de Rav Huna bar Tachlifa. He quotes Rav Huna bar Tachlifa who says, V'nema, I have a much better solution here. Why do you have to say that the asham was either an asham matzora, or if not an asham matzora, so we'll say it's a voluntary peace offering? I have a better solution. Nema asham zeh ye asham talui. Why don't we say it's an asham talui? What's an asham talui? Remember, a hanging guilt offering. What does that mean? Generally, we say, and here we're going to see that maybe it means something else, but generally we say, when do I bring a hanging guilt offering? It's when I'm not sure if I did a sin that I'm obligated a chatat. So, for example, I have 2 pieces of meat fat in front of me. I ate one of them. I know now, later I find out that one of them was fat, which was permitted, and one of them was chaylev, which is not permitted. But I don't know was the one on the right or the left the one that was chaylev. I know I ate the one on the right, let's say, but I don't know was that the chaylev one or not. So I am now in a bind because I can't bring a chatat because I don't know that I did a sin. You can't bring it if I'm not sure. So the Torah gives you an opportunity to bring what we call an asham talui, hanging guilt offering. This provides me with atonement until I figure out, did I actually really sin or not? When I find out that I did sin, let's say, then I have to bring a chatat. But until then, I bring an asham talui. Okay, so what does that have to do with this? How can I just bring a random asham talui? Well, Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that I can actually bring a voluntary asham talui. Now, this is, some people are hypochondriacs, right? They think they're always sick. So you can have a person who's a little obsessive and thinks maybe that they sin like all the time. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I did this, maybe I did that, maybe I did that. So do we allow them to bring an asham talui whenever they want? Rabbi Eliezer says yes. So if that's the case, and you can bring a voluntary asham talui, why don't we say that's what he should do? And then that resolves the whole issue. And then this wouldn't be a question at all for our sugya of bringing something lebeit hapsul, because asham talui and asham mitzora are both going to have the same time limitations. So that would be perfect. And that's a much better solution. So Rav Rachuma quotes Rav Huna bar Tachlifa saying, why didn't he just say, either it's asham talui, right? Either it's asham mitzora or it's asham talui. So comes Rav Rachuma and he says to Ravina, Shma minaf, and the fact that they didn't offer this must be that man tana lepalig alei to Rabbi Eliezer. Who's the tana who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer about this asham talui thing? Rabbi Shimon he to Amar aim nadvim asham talui, which by the way makes sense. If he doesn't think you could bring a nedava of shemen, right? He's a little bit more limiting of what kind of voluntary offerings. You can see there could be different approaches. Oh yeah, voluntarily bring whatever you want, right? Obviously you can't bring whatever you want. You can't bring sin offering voluntarily, but let's be more wide about what we're going to allow, right? Like every person theoretically could always potentially maybe have done a sin. So we can allow this versus a person who, says, no, you can't just bring whatever you want. You have to be very, exacting about what you really are obligated in, and only if there's really a situation where it fits the criteria. Like I said, there were 2 pieces in front of you. You ate one. You don't know which one was, you knew one is problem. It's much more specific. So the fact that Rabbi Shimon doesn't suggest this, and yet he suggests bringing the shalmei as a potential shalmei nedava, creating this problem, but disqualifying something too early, shows that he must disagree with it, which sounds very reasonable. But Ravina, who basically Rav Rachuma was telling this to Ravina responds and says, Amarle, Torah, what happened to the Torah? You missed some very basic point. Imre, and by the way, maybe this makes you feel a little better if you don't remember all the details of all the sacrifices and which ones you bring. Obviously, Rav Rachuma didn't remember them either, because get this one. Imre b'dichre mechalfelach. You're confusing sheep and rams. Okay? Now, I mentioned this before, and I wasn't 100% confident, but yes, a ram is by the way, if you look up in general, a ram is a sheep that is older, not exactly 2 year, the way the Torah defines it, but the Torah defines it as actually just entering into its 2nd year, after its first birthday, after it's been through 1 year. The first year it's called a sheep, the 2nd year it's called an ayil, a ram. So there's a difference. Now most korbanot Hashem, if you remember, are brought, maybe you don't remember, but they're brought from a ram, an ayil. But the Asham Matzorah is an exception. It's brought from a keves ben shana, the 1-year-old, not the 2-year-old. So you can't bring one animal and say this could either count for an asham mitzora or count for an asham talui, because the asham talui is brought with a ram, and the asham mitzora is brought from a sheep. So very nice to think maybe Rabbi Shimon could have suggested that, and that maybe proves that he doesn't think that you could bring an asham talui whenever you want. But that's not true, because there's no way you could bring that. That's why it only really works with a shlamim, because a shlamim could be brought from a ram, a 2-year-old, but not an asham. I'm sorry, the opposite, the keves. You could bring the keves. The mitzora is the one that's an exception to the rule, right? Remember, most ashams are brought from rams. Asham mitzora and asham nazir are the two exceptions where they're brought from a sheep who's 1-year-old or under a year, right, in its first year. So basically, you're going to have to bring it as a potential shlamim, and you can't bring it as a potential asham talui, so that whole argument falls to the side. New Mishnah. More ta'aruvot. This Mishnah is going to be interesting because we're going to have a machloket, Rabbi Eliezer, Chachamim. The Gemara is going to explain what's the root of the machloket. And then they're going to bring a braita and say, by the way, not everybody agrees that this is a machloket. So our Mishnah presents one version of the debate, and in a braita, Rabbi Yehuda brings a completely different version of the debate, and that they don't actually debate this at all. Okay? And then you're going to have to remember, because after we go through that whole, then we're going to go through that whole version of Rabbi Yehuda and what the logic is for that. And then we're going to get to our next Mishnah, which only fits if you go with our Mishnah, so that Mishnah would follow that one. Otherwise, the next Mishnah is really the case that we already discussed in the braita. So if you didn't understand, that's fine. We'll go through after. So according to our Mishnah, the machlokah between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis is about, you have pieces, limbs of the body, of a chatat, a sin offering, and an olah. What's the problem? Olah gets completely burnt. The chatat, part of it gets burnt, and the rest of it is given to the kohen, the male kohanim, to eat. So if you have limbs of chatat, so what do you do? Rabbi Eliezer says kind of the obvious, which is yitain lamala. You burn them all, right? Because let's just be more strict, right? Instead of giving the meat to the kohen, burn all the whole sin offering. Now, it sounds like an easy solution, but what's the problem? Well, you can't burn things on the altar, and that's why I said we're going to come back to this Rabbi Eliezer we saw before. You can't offer things l'reach nichach if they're not supposed to be there. So he says, so I view them as if they're firewood. In other words, if it's an olah, then I'm burning them all for the sake of God. If they're not, then I'm burning the meat of the chatat, which I'm not supposed to burn. I'm burning it for the sake of wood. Now, you can't just bring whatever you want on the altar. V'chachamim obrim, Chachamim are very stringent here, and they say you can't just go by the more stringent one. You can't just bring things on the altar unnecessarily. So in that case, since you have this mixture, you actually can't use any of them. So what do? In a sense, you have to burn them, but you can't burn them until they're disqualified. So you have to wait until they get disqualified. And there's a big machloket about what this means to ubar tsuratan. It means you should become deformed. But it doesn't really mean deformed. Either it means wait till they're disqualified, which is when? The next day already. Remember? If you leave it overnight and you didn't bring it on the altar, it can't be brought anymore. It's disqualified. And it's also notar, right? It's left beyond its time. And some people say, no, this is more than that. Otherwise it would say, leave it for the morning, right? Psul linat should have said, leave it overnight. They say it has to get, moldy and rotten, and only then can you really destroy it. Because even though it's notar and disqualified, it still looks very good, and it's not appropriate to burn sanctified items when they're in perfect shape. So some people say it means wait till they're completely, rotten to destroy them. Okay, this is, by the way, like Shemitah produce. People wait till it's rotten till they throw it out. That kind of idea. Anything sanctified can't just be thrown out or burned or destroyed unless it's disqualified. And then there's just a range of what disqualified means. So now we have, so their machloket is basically, what do we do with this Evrei Chatat and Evrei Olah? So now the Gemara says, "My Tamid Rabbi Eliezer." What's his reason? Amar Kra, back to the pasuk we saw before. Ve'el mizbeach lo ya'alu l'reach nichach. Right? Don't put these. Now remember the subject. The subject was seor and dvash, leavened items and honey. Don't put on the altar. And then it said, right? El mizbeach lo ya'alu l'reach nichach. So don't put them on the altar for reach nichach. So it says, and what he says is, if you could put seor and dvash on the altar, l'shem etzim, then you can put anything on the altar, l'shem etzim, right? As long as you say, I'm not putting this right. And again, if it's an ola, it's going for the sacrifice. If it's not an ola, then it's just going for the sake of firewood. That's okay. Now, why don't the rabbis agree with this? Because the rabbis said, Mir Rachmana Otam. The pasuk, when it said, now it's not exactly in the right place for this drasha, but it says, in that same pasuk, Korban Reshit Takrivu Otam LaHashem. Sacrifice these, and bring these to God as a Korban Reshit, which again we said means the She'alechem and the, there's only unique circumstances you could bring them. But don't offer them up on the altar, but you can offer them l'shem etzim. Come the rabbis and they say, well, that pasuk is talking only about seor and dvash. How do we know? Because it says otam, these and nothing else. So that means these and nothing else can be l'shem etzim. You can't just offer anything l'shem etzim. We're going to allow you, if you want to put, for whatever reason, you put chametz or dvash, which usually means dates or figs on the altar, so you shouldn't, but if you do it for firewood, it's okay. But doesn't mean that you can take chatad and burn it l'shem etzim. That doesn't work. Okay, so otam yatamale avatamale l'shem etzim avamidi achrini lo, but not anything else. Rabbi Eliezer. So now we have to say, what does Rabbi Eliezer do with otam? Otam is a limiting word. It means only these. But there's obviously other things mentioned in this pasuk. So what does he think only these refer to? Hu derabe lecha kevesh kamizbech. Okay, this is another thing that's not said explicitly in the pasuk. But it says, don't put these on the altar. They mean not only on the altar can you not put them, you also can't put them on the ramp. And then he's saying, only seor and dvash are not allowed on the ramp, just as if we treat the ramp as if it's the altar. Avamidi achrini lo. But other things, if we put them on the ramp, like things that aren't supposed to go on the altar, but we put them on the ramp, that's fine. You didn't transgress the negative prohibition by just putting it on the ramp, because the ramp doesn't have the same sanctity as the altar. And then he uses the otam for something else entirely. Notice, by the way, he uses it to be lenient about other things, and the rabbis use it to be stringent about other things. Other things can't be brought l'shem etzim. It's two very different directions of this limitation. You're limiting some heter, you're limiting some isser. V'rabbanan tartei shmamina. Now, the rabbis actually learn both. They say, otam, everything in this pasuk is only seor and dvash, whether it's the ramp or whether it's the l'shem etzim. Okay, so they just take it as you can learn them both because otam is just a limiting thing. Whatever's in this pasuk is only talking about seor and dvash. Okay, that was option number one of the machloket, that they're arguing over chatat and olah. Can you burn them l'shem etzim? Can you not burn them l'shem etzim? Does that pasuk where it limits and where it says, it says, well, you can't do things you do them l'shem etzim? Is that limited only to seor and dvash, according to the rabbis, and therefore they don't allow this? Or is it more expansive? And that's what Rabbi Eliezer says, and that's why he allows it. But now we're going to see version 2 of the machloket. I see you're asking, how do we learn two things? It's not two things. That's what I'm trying to say. It's the same thing. It's these halachot in this pasuk are limited to otam. That's why you can do both, because it's only really one thing. It's saying everything in this pasuk, anything we want to learn from here, the ramp is like the altar, you can do things l'shem etzim, is all just relevant to these things. It's actually more of a chiddush to say that this applies to all sorts of other things. Now, matnitzin deloki hai tana, but our mission is not like the following tana, like Rabbi Yehuda, because listen to the way Rabbi Yehuda understands the machloket of Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis in a completely different way. Ditana, as it says in a braita, Amal Rabbi Yehuda. Right, this is, by the way, kind of common, where earlier Tanaim are having a machloket, and later Tanaim come and say, this happens a lot, by the way, with Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, because they were much earlier, right? And they say, oh, well, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel weren't actually arguing, right? We think they were arguing about this, someone else thinks they were arguing about something else. So it happens sometimes with even later Tanaim. Okay, so here we have this machloket, and Rabbi Yehuda comes later and says, you know what? That's not what they were arguing about. Lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer v'chamim al evrei chatat shenitavu be'evrei olah she'yikaravu. Everybody thinks the chatat and olah you can burn on the altar. That's not a problem, because both are valid sacrifices. And so what? You burn something you're not supposed to burn, you say l'shem etzim, that works across the board. Okay, not like we just said. And they both agree that if it was an animal that engaged in bestiality that mixed in with other animals that hadn't, that you can't, no matter what, put them on the altar and say, oh, I'm doing this l'shem etzim, because that's really something despicable that can't go on the altar. So what's their machloket? Alma nechleku, because it's obvious they had a machloket. So what's a machloket about, according to Rabbi Yehuda? Again, we're still in the braita. Al evrei olat mima shenitarvu be'evrei ba'alat mum. You have limbs of a korban ola, of a good animal, that get mixed up with limbs of a blemished animal. Soon we're going to have to ask, what's the difference between blemished and rovea nirba, right? An animal engaged in bestiality is bad, and so is a baal mum. So why are we going to distinguish? But that's the machloket. Rabbi Eliezer or Meir, and then the opinions go consistent with what we saw before. The Rabbi Eliezer is going to be more lenient, says yikravu, we can sacrifice them. And I look at that, the blemished animal parts that we don't know which is which, but we say whichever ones were blemished animal, that's just l'shem itzim, and whatever was for good animal, that was for the shem ola. V'chachamim omrim lo yikrivu. So now we ask the question, Rabbi Eliezer, Mishna, rovea v'nirba de lo chazu, ba'alam mum nami lo chazi, right? I think animal engaged in bestiality is not appropriate to go on the altar. Neither is a blemished animal. So how are you accepting the blemished animal, but not the rovea v'nirba? So turning now to Amud Bet, we're going to have two answers to this question. We're going to start with Rav Huna, ask a question on Rav Huna, raise a difficulty. Rav Papa is going to resolve it, but then we're going to reject it completely. So that's all going to be within one answer, and then we're going to try a totally different answer, because that's going to be rejected. Amar Rav Huna, this is a favorite, by the way, Bidukin Shaba'ayin. It's a problem. Some people say it's in the cornea of the eye, some sort of mum in the eye. We're not sure what it is, there's different opinions, but it's a mild blemish. And this blemish, Rabbi Akiva was lenient about. V'aliva de Rabbi Akiva. So now we're going to say that Rabbi Eliezer, according to, so you're saying cataract. That's what I'm saying. There was a machloket about what it is. Some people say it's cataract. Some people say it's the cornea. There's many different opinions about what the dukan shaba'ayin is. That's why I don't want to get into it. It's not so important for our purposes. It's some sort of issue in the eye. Many different opinions about what they are. But according to Rabbi Akiva, so now you have to say, this opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, which was stated by Rabbi Yehuda, while trying to explain this, is all about the dukin. It's all according to Rabbi Akiva, who's lenient about the blemish of a dukin shaba'ayin, because not everyone is. And in what way is he lenient? Well, he says, imalu lo yirdu. If you put a blemished animal with a dukin shaba'ayin, not some other blemish that's more serious, but with this dukin shaba'ayin, you put it on the altar, you don't have to take it down. Other blemished animals you have to take off the altar. But Rabbi Akiva, again, only Rabbi Akiva holds this, but Rabbi Akiva holds, imalu lo yirdu, and then you'd explain it all according to him. What's the problem with this? Well, Imr da Amar Rabbi Akiva, di avad, l'chatchila miyamar. Rabbi Akiva said that only im alu lo yirdu. If you put it on the altar, you don't have to take it off. He didn't say you could put it on l'chatchila. We have a situation now, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, about Rabbi Shimon's opinion. We have a mixed, intermingled items. We can't just say, oh, well, just put it on the altar when you know there's a blemished animal there. That's l'chatchila. By the way, di'evet, if you ever wonder what b'di'evet is and how we got to the etymology, like what's the word? Not exactly the etymology, but the how you got to that word. Well, here the Gemara reads it as di'i avad. I is im, if, and avad is does. If he did it. Okay? Avad is did. Past tense. Di'i avad. B'di avad is often in Aramaic like an olive drops. So b'di'evet is without the olive, but it's really b'di'i avad, which is, right, if he did it. Okay, and that's how you would, if it was done already. That's why it's post facto. So anyway, he says, only b'di'evet, not l'chatchila. So how can you explain that? So Amar Papa, one more limitation of this case, or as we say, ukimta, like what exactly was this case in the braita they were talking about? Hacha b'mayaskina kigon she'alu al gabei kevesh. We're going to turn it into a b'di'evet situation. So now we're going to say a bunch of things. We had a blemished animal which had a problem of dukan shaba'ayin, which was mixed up with other animals that weren't blemished. Okay, right? Body parts. We're not talking about animals. We're talking about body parts of these animals. Once the animals were slaughtered, the pieces got mixed up. And it's only according to Rabbi Akiva, who says, imalu lo yirdu. And it was already put up on the ramp. So since it was already put up on the ramp, it was like it was on the mizbeach, and therefore we don't have to take it off. That's already a lot of ukimtas, but okay, let's say it is. Now we have a bigger problem. Ihachi, now remember the case. It was intermingled body parts. If you're saying all those things, that it was already, right, on the ramp, and it was dukat shabayim, it was Rabbi Akiva's opinion, Ihachi afilu beinayu. Well then, you don't need a case to be intermingled. it would be permitted if you held like Rabbi Akiva and they already went on the ramp and it was just a Dugan Shabbayim problem, you would be able to, if you only had an animal body parts from an animal like that, you would definitely be able to leave it on the altar. You didn't need it to be intermingled. So why is the machloket about intermingling? Should be even, right? Even before it got intermingled, even if it's on its own. And that's not what we're talking about. So it doesn't make any sense to say that. So they completely reject this opinion. And now we're going to go back saying it's a regular Baal Mum that got intermingled with other animals. So now, really, why does Rabbi Eliezer allow this? If he doesn't allow the Rovea ben Yirba, why would he allow this? So Ella, option 2 is to explain, Tame de Rabbi Eliezer, Mi'et Rachmana Mum Bam. This pasuk about a mum, we're now moving to the Yikra, chapter 22, verse 25, where it says, at the end of that pasuk, Ki moshchitam bahem, because they're disgusting, or some sort of word like that. Mum bam, there's a blemish in them. Lo yeratzu lachem. Okay, we're going to dart to this bahem soon, and the bam, which are really the same thing, right? In them. So now they say the following. What does it mean, mum bam? There's a mum in them. Okay? Mum bam hu lo yeratzu. The korban will not be accepted. God won't accept your korban if it's definitely blemished, if the blemish is in them. But hal yidei ta'arovet yeratzu. Rabbi Eliezer basically says, we call it Gzerat HaKatuv. The pasuk says so. The pasuk says ta'arovot are permitted. Intermingling of blemished and non-blemished animals is just simply permitted, because only if it's definitively blemished. And now we have a case where the mum isn't necessarily in it, right? We know it's not in all of them, so you can put them on the altar. And that's a totally different way of understanding it. Until now we thought it was, you look at it like they're eitzim. No, now we're saying it's just not a problem at all. So, Rabbanan, okay, so first we have to do a little ping pong, and then we're going to have a question of Rabbi Eliezer, this explanation of Rabbi Eliezer from the words of the braita, but we'll get there soon. V'Rabbanan mum bam hu d'lo yiratzu. What do they do with the mum bam? Yes, if there's a mum in it, it doesn't get accepted. Ha'avar mumam yiratzu. What is it telling you? If the blemish is a passing blemish, though, and it passes, like it's a temporary thing, then it's accepted. Okay? So once the mum bam means the blemish is in it now, but not if the blemish moves from it, is removed, then you can actually use it. Okay, well, that's a general principle, right? A blemish has to be a blemish that's permanent, not one that's going to pass. So, Rabbi Eliezer, where does he learn that? Mi bam bahem. Because it says moshchatam bahem, and it says mum bam, you can learn two different things, one from that one from that one. Rabbanan bam bahem lo darshan. The rabbis just don't darshan both those words. Okay, but now we have a different problem. As I said, if we assume this is Gzerat HaKatuv, the pasuk says, mum bam, only blemished animals can't go. But a blemished animal mixed up with regular animals is not a problem. Tarovet is not a problem. Well, look at the words. Go back to the braita at the bottom of Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph. What did it say? They argue about Evrei Baal Mum that mix up with others. Rabbi Eliezer says, Yikravu, you can sacrifice them. V'ro'ani lamala ki'ilu hemetzim. And I view the ones that went up above, the Baalei Mum, which really can't go on the altar, I view them as if they're wood. But no, that's not what we just said. Okay, so the Gemara says, Yihachi ro'eh, right, that language. I look at it as if this, harachmana achshaveh. You don't need to say, I view it as if they're eitzim. You just say, the Torah permitted it. It's not a problem because the Torah permitted it. That doesn't make any sense. So how do you explain that? And with this, we'll end this section. L'divreihem ka'amar. We have this a lot, where Rabbi Eliezer actually holds it's Gzerat HaKatuv, and if you were asking him his own opinion, he wouldn't have said it like this. He wouldn't have said ro'ani. He's speaking according to the rabbis. He says to the rabbis like this. L'divreihem ka'amar. I'm speaking according to you. L'didi, according to me, Rachmana achshaveh. I think the rabbis permitted this completely. Okay? The Torah permitted this completely. But lididchu, you don't read the pasuk the way I do. So, but even though you don't read the pasuk the way I do, odu limiyad, at least agree with me. The basar ba'alat mum ke'etzim dami mididavi abasar chatat. Why don't you just at least agree with me that at least when it's intermingled, so maybe the Torah doesn't permit it completely, but you could sacrifice it as if it's, eitzim, just like you yourselves agree. Remember this version. According to this version, the rabbis agree when it's basar chatat, so why don't you allow the same thing when it's a mum? Now, why would the rabbis differentiate mum and chatat? Very obviously, because, right, the rabbis say, v'rabbanan, hacham mi'iseh, hatam lo mi'iseh. will allow chatat and say we view this as wood because chatat is a perfectly good korban. But a blemished animal, and even though it's just not supposed to be burned, but it is a perfectly good korban, a blemished animal is disgusting to bring on the altar. We don't want to bring God blemished animals, so we can't use the eitzim excuse in that situation. Okay, and that's basically the second explanation for how to understand this second version of the machloket between them. Remember, we had two versions of the machloket. Is it olah and chatat that they disagree about? Or do they agree olah and chatat work, and they agree rovei and yerba don't work, and their question is just the moon? And then the question is, what's the machloket after rejecting the first opinion that it's just this mild blemish, and that's the difference between that and the bestiality animals. But we rejected that, and then we said in the end, no. It's that there's a special pasuk that basically says only completely blemished animals are permitted, but if it's blemished animals mixed in a mixture, it's not. That's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion anyway. The rabbis don't accept that drasha. And that's really his answer. And when he speaks to the rabbis, he says, Ro'ani ki'ilu it's eitzim. That was just trying to convince the rabbis, at least within their worldview, they should at least agree with this. But they don't, because they differentiate between maus and not maus. Okay, new Mishnah. Evarim ve'evarim ba'alei mumim. Now, according to this was already the previous case in the braita, according to what we just learned. But according to the Mishnah, the first case in the Mishnah was Chatan and Ola, and now we're up to another machloket about Evarim ve'evarim, and it's not going to be the same as we just saw. Here, Rabbi Eliezer is not going to be as lenient and say, oh yeah, just put it on the mizbeach, even though according to Rabbi Yehuda's version, he was. But according to this version, and this actually we learned already, if you have Evarim ve'evarim ba'alei mumim, blemished animal parts mixed up with other ones, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, you need one more thing to add. Really, theoretically, he should have said l'shem eitzim is fine, but he wanted to be a little more stringent in this version. Im karev rosh echad mehem yikrevu kol harashim. You can use this tolin that we learned about on Taf Ayin Dalet, which is if you sacrifice one head of them, the Kohen's not supposed to sacrifice them ideally. But if you already sacrificed one of them, of this mixture, you can assume, you can kind of say, oh, maybe the problematic one is there, and the rest are going to be permitted. And same thing with krayim. If you did, one of the thigh of one of them, krayim shel chamehem, or the leg, yikrevu kol krayim. Okay, you can then sacrifice them all. V'chachamim omrim afilu kirvu kulam chutz me'chamehem. You could have done the overwhelming majority of them. There's only one Baal Mum in there, right? And you did a lot of them, and there's only one left. And you would say, okay, for sure the majority, right? Majority rules, it's in that other pile. Yetzeh lebeit hasrifa. He doesn't care. Even if there's only one left, you have to leave it to burn. In other words, if the Kohen accidentally sacrificed all of them, that last one still has to be burned. You can't use it. So you see here in general, the rabbis have a much more stringent position. Now we get to something we already saw in Daf Ayin Dalet. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, lo echshtir Rabbi Eliezer, ela shnayim shnayim. Remember, Rabbi Eliezer only permits two at a time. In other words, you have to do a pair at the end. It sounded like he said just sacrifice them all after. You can only do two at a time because remember, heter mixed with isser. Then it makes it allowed. You can't just bring something on the altar that might be completely asr. If we do two together, that helps us. Mativ Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, how can you say that's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion? Look at what the rabbis say. Chachamim who disagree with him say, afilu kirvu kulan chutz me'achad mehem yetzeh lebeit hasrifa. That last one has to be left to burn, which seems like Rabbi Eliezer agrees if there's only one left, it sounds like you could have sacrificed it, but he said it has to be done in pairs. Again, Rabbi Elazar the Amora explained about Rabbi Eliezer the Tana. So Rabbi Elazar the Amora's opinion of Rabbi Eliezer seems problematic. The language of the Mishnah, to which Amalo Rabbi Yaakov the Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yaakov says to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Bar Tachlifa, Ezber alach. I'll explain this to you. Ma echad zug echad. When he said one, he meant one pair. Okay, and that resolves the problem. Okay, last thing for today, 2 lines of this Mishnah. Dam shenitarev b'mayim. We've seen this actually with a mikvah sugya. If you have a mikvah that wine falls into it and it starts to look like the color of wine, it's a problem. If it doesn't look like wine, it's okay. This is the reverse, but the same logic. If you have blood, that water gets mixed up within the blood. Okay, before we were talking about mixtures of body parts. Now we're talking about the blood. Im yesh bo mar'it dam. If it still looks like blood, kasher. The water doesn't disqualify it. Same thing with wine. Nitarev b'yayin. If wine mixes in, now we're assuming red wine, red blood. How are you going to tell the difference, right? You can't say, oh, if it looks like wine, if it looks like blood still, it's obviously going to look like blood. So what do? Ro'ino toki iluhu mayim. You assess. If that amount of wine was water and it fell into the blood, Would it look like water or would it look like blood? If it would still look like blood, then you can still use it. And same thing with the last case, nitarev b'dam behema or b'dam achaya. What if it was mixed up with chulin, blood from a chulin animal, a non-sanctified animal, or with the blood of a chaya, an undomesticated animal, which can never be brought for sacrifices, like a deer. Ro'ino toki ilu humayim, same thing. You view it as if it's as if it was water, and if it would still look like blood, it would look like blood. Anyway, we have to see Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. We're going to disagree, and then when we get to tomorrow, but we're going to stop here in the Mishna. So what we did today is we finished up the log shemen, how that works, and all the possible issues of having it either voluntary offering of oil or for the mitzoref, and then we resolved that. Then raised a question back on how we do the korban, and then couldn't it just be an asham taloi? That would have been an easier solution. Could we learn from that Rabbi Shimon doesn't think you could bring asham talois all the time? And we said no, because that would be a possibility because they're two different aged animals, and therefore there's no way you could have brought it as either that or that. Then we got to the evrei chatat with the evrei olah, which we already reviewed already. But again, two different versions of what they said. Each time we explained what the machloket is based on, and then had some difficulties along the way, but figured them all out. Then we moved to this new Mishnah about Ivarim Bevarim, which we already learned already, which in that case, Rabbi Eliezer is also lenient, but requires something else to happen first. He doesn't allow you just to go sacrifice it, but he does say that even if, as long as one of them went, then that would actually permit the rest. And from there, we had, it has to be bezugot only, and then we got to the blood mixing with other substances. Okay, there was one thing on Ayin Hay that I needed to review that I forgot. I made a mistake. Someone corrected me after class. Thank you, Ruth. And it was, let me just remember which case it was. It was the blood. Okay, that was why. Thanks for reminding me, Ruth. The blood there, we talked about the blood has to have enough of an amount to do the placings of the blood when two sacrifices of the blood were mixed together. So there, actually, I said it wrong. It had to be enough place. You had to put the blood on the corners. You could do it in one placing or four from the blood together, but it had to be like a double amount, enough for it to be blood placed on the altar for both sacrifices. Not that there had to be enough blood in the cup. It was more that the blood you put on the placements had to be enough blood. So thank you for the correction, and wishing everyone a good day. That's it for today, and a good week.